Ladies and gentlemen, I've got to be honest and say at the moment, the world just feels like clown world per excellence. I mean, everything just seems so retarded. How are we going to get to all of these news stories today? I'm going to try and make this video as quick as possible. I've got a serious amount to talk about. But before we do get onto the videos of today, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. You know that it helps. So anyway, let's get on to the main news stories. And so the first news story is that the UNHRC, that's the Human Rights Council, has been criticized for having what's been described as a permanent agenda item on calling out Israel. Now, you may not think that's important. You may say, yet again, Byron, why are you concentrating on the UN's agenda with Israel? Why is Israel so important? And again, we're going to get to that because it kind of ties in with a lot of issues that are going on, well, in South Africa, to be honest. Now, one of the members of the UN Watch took to the floor at the Human Rights Council to condemn meeting under the Council's only agenda item specifically targeting a country, well, Israel, saying that the UN did not speak at all about peace and turned a blind eye to abuses in China, in Iran, in Russia, and in Cuba. And Cuba naturally tried to interrupt and shut it down, but it didn't work, and he finished his intervention. Now, that's quite important because China, Russia, Iran, Cuba, all allies of South Africa. So we already see which side of let's call it the international diplomatic aisle we sit. Now, this is starting to lead many individuals to ask a fundamental question. That is, if the UN does not meet next year, what does it really mean? Like, will any of us even notice? Will we even care? And I'll leave you with that thought because I thought about this long and hard, and I think the actual answer would be no. We'd probably have a better world if it didn't meet, because the UN at the moment is fundamentally flawed in its makeup. It isn't doing what it's set out to do. So moving on to the next story, and this is the news story around the Charlie Kirk assassination. Now, if you know anything about the story, there's been a lot of, let's call it controversies on the suggestion that it must have been Mossad and the IDF who killed Charlie Kirk because he had become somehow very anti-Israeli. And this was actually a narrative being pushed forward by some American right-wingers. I say right-wingers in quotation marks. And noticeably, you could see this being pushed forward by Candace Owens. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu actually came out and said, well, actually, everything that Candace Owens is saying is untrue, and he knows it because Charlie Kirk wrote him a letter to express his deep love for Israel. And he actually warned Israel of losing the social media war, and he urged Israel to build a rapid response media machine to counter fast-spreading anti-Israeli narratives. So, this letter was originally disputed by Candace Owens. She said that basically Netanyahu was lying. And would you know it, Netanyahu released the letter in full, and the authenticity of it has been corroborated by Charlie Kirk's Foundation. So what the letter actually showed is that the narrative pushed forward by Candace Owens was actually false. So basically she just made this up, and a lot of her reasons for it seem to have been nothing more than just to be oppositional to the Jewish state and oppositional in the United States. So this entire scandal is threatening to, well, undermine Candace Owens' entire credibility, with many individuals suggesting that her career is now effectively finished. Now, in terms of Israel, let us remember that Trump proposed the 20-point Gaza peace plan, and there were endorsements, public endorsements from Israel, Egypt, Indonesia, Jordan, Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the UAE, France, and Italy. But it does seem in the last day or so like Qatar's PM seems to be walking back his full-throttled endorsement, and he's instead said that the plan is in the early stages and needs development. And this is after the Qatari leadership took the plan through to Hamas and discussed it. And so it does now look like the plan may not actually be accepted by Hamas. So now one has to ask the fundamental question. If you were in a genocide where you were being genocided every day and you were given an option for peace, wouldn't you sue for peace? Why would you sue to keep fighting and being destroyed and your people being genocided? Like, who would do that willingly? That seems to be really stupid. In any case, it has been noted that outside of the White House, after the peace deal was proposed, a pro-Palestinian Islamist group gathered and called for the global intifada. And so this call of the globalization of the intifada has led many individuals to ask the question, Donald Trump literally just presented a plan to end the war, and yet they're protesting him, and they still want terror. And so one has to ask the question as to whether or not they actually want peace, or whether the entire aim is just to spread jihad. And I know what my opinion on this is. You can let me know in the comment section below what yours is. So moving then on to the US, and this is the news that the Solidarity Movement went and had a follow-up meeting at the White House. Now, this triggered the South African Minister, Ronald Lamola, of International Relations, and the acting police minister to criticize Solidarity and AfriForum for their alleged treason, which they say are now being investigated. Now, following this, the White House has actually requested an explanation for the South African minister's remarks and have asked for more detail on Solidarity's proposed trade framework. So it does actually look like Solidarity is actually getting further in terms of the trade negotiation than what the South African government is. Now, Solidarity's head of international liaison, Jaco, flew to Washington to attend a meeting where they were discussing the potential trade agreement between the US and South Africa. Now, both sides want a trade agreement. That's the US and Solidarity, and US officials are clearly frustrated with the South African government, which is why they're engaging with Solidarity. Now, part of the discussions have included special economic zones and tariff relief options, and how AGOA codes could be used for relief on South Africa. Now, proposals include exempting American businesses from race laws, that's BEE. These have all been tabled, and while so far the South African government appears to be resisting this. But what it clearly shows you is that the South African government's diplomatic infrastructure has just imploded. Politically, it's lacking. No one wants to negotiate with South Africa. The US clearly would prefer to negotiate with Solidarity than they would with Pretoria. Now, part of the reason for this actually is around South Africa's corruption, because you have to notice that between 1995 and today, South Africa was ranked one of the least corrupt countries as per the Transparency International scales, and this was alongside Japan and Belgium. But now today, South Africa is classed as one of the most corrupt countries according to the exact same scales. So 30 years worth of ANC rule has led us to being one of the least corrupt to now one of the most corrupt. And this is exemplified in what's actually currently going on in the Tembisa Hospital SIU report, which clearly shows the levels to which the ANC have gone in order to loot the state. 2 billion rand looted from Tembisa. Now, the health minister was shocked.
I could just say is wow, and a big wow advocate. And you'll remember the wow I also made to you before, last year. The question which I am struggling, maybe somebody within this house will help me. Why Tembisa Hospital? Why Tembisa Hospital? Why was it selected by so many syndicates? What was their purpose and what drove them? I think those questions need to be answered.
Many individuals are looking at the ANC's actual response to the level of theft, the very embedded corruption that has destroyed the state. And the ANC's approach to it appears to be nothing more than just saying, well, corruption happens, terribly sorry, we'll try better next time. And this is leading many to say that existentially, the ANC is corrupt. People have been highlighting to the ANC for some time that the fundamental risk to the NHR is the corruption embedded in the ANC, how they will loot the funds dry. And the problem is that this inevitably has real-life effects on individuals. This is yours and mine life that are effective. Whistleblowers embedded in these structures, when they come through and they even state publicly where they proclaim how the funds are being looted, they're taken out time and time again. And we're seeing this right now in real time with the former police minister. But anyway, moving swiftly on, and that is the Firearms Control Amendment Act, because in a parliamentary question to the current police minister, Ian Cameron, the hero of South Africa, he asked around the tabling of the new firearms legislation. Now, this is following the news that had come out that Nedbank had been involving itself with the redrafting of state legislation around firearms control. Now, the police minister, the acting police minister, did issue a response to Ian Cameron, and in it he was very vague and elusive, and he appears to suggest that basically the 2021 version, which was rejected by public participation, like overwhelmingly, well, that is the legislation currently being put forward by the relevant committees to the parliamentary committee, that the legislation itself has largely remained unchanged. It's just been recycled. Now, for those of you who don't remember, that legislation basically looks to ban the personal ownership of firearms for the purposes of self-defense. In a country that's as corrupt as ours, where the police in this state are just completely irrelevant and unable to fulfill their mandate, you would think that providing the police with the monopoly on violence would just seem really, really daft. And there are so many questions that Ian Cameron says remain unanswered, such as how many state-owned firearms are still missing? SAPS's stats itself shows that illegal firearms are the main driver of gun violence in the country, and the Central Firearms Register remains dysfunctional and corrupt. And ultimately, why was the public reaction, the public rejection of the 2021 draft legislation ignored by the police ministry? All very important questions, and all very worrying that, again, our political elite are just retarded. Now, coming back to the scandal of Aaron and the Tembisa looting by the ANC cadres, you will notice yesterday, if you watch my video, that Aaron said he understands why China executes corruption accused. And you know what? I actually want to talk about that very quickly. And that is that in China, an ex-agricultural minister has now been sentenced to death. The People's Court heard a case of the theft of 268 million yuan, that's 37.6 million US, which this individual, this corrupt minister, received bribes from 2007 to 2024. Now, he received those bribes in cash and property, and I must say, 36 million US, it's actually a drop in the ocean compared to some of the funds that we've seen looted in this country. I mean, Tembisa are 2 billion rand. That's like 100 million US. In any case, the individual was initially expelled from the Communist Party in November 2024. He was removed early in 2024 from his position. He's noticed that the ANC never did to any of its corruption accused, and the death sentence has now been passed with the acknowledgement of this individual's confessions. Because that's what they do in China. You see, their conscience comes out and they confess to their sins. Now, part of Xi Jinping's sweeping anti-corruption campaign, the individual was targeted, and would you know, he's been sentenced to death by firing squad. You see, this is the way China deals with it. And I must say, if this is how the ANC dealt with their corruption accused, there would be no ANC left, because they'd all be, well, you know exactly where they'd be. In any case, moving on, we need to look at the global arena, specifically in terms of global retardation when it comes to political agendas. Because for those of you who know, there is this shipment of all these peace-loving individuals who are currently going through to Palestine. Now, this global Floatia is currently sailing through to Palestine to break the blockade. And one of the individuals who are included in the Floatia is actually the grandson of Nelson Mandela. Now, this Floatia is due to reach Israel on Yom Kippur. So it's a massive, it's probably the most important holy day ever. It's like us going off to the Middle East and Eid and then trying to cause a ruckus. Like, that's one of their holiest days. Why would you do that? That just seems stupid. And many individuals are noticing that the actual arrival of the Floatia isn't just about politics, but it's an attack on Jewish values and spirituality. In other news, well, as you know, the Floatia is going through to Israel, and the person who's pushing it forward, the spearhead of the campaign, is the dipshit, also known as Greta Thunberg. I don't know why anybody takes this weirdo seriously anymore. She just seems to get more potty by the day. Well, the IDF, as they're currently in Gaza and working their way through Hamas command centers, well, they found documents. They seized documents where they show that Greta Thunberg appears to have been funded by Hamas, meaning that the actual Floatia itself is a political event. It is not a human rights event. Now, the first document that they produced was a letter which explicitly shows that the Palestinian Conference for Palestinians Abroad, which has been described as a Hamas representative body abroad, acts a bit like embassies established in 2018. And this conference are one of the key individuals who are part of the Floatia. Why? Because the Palestinian Conference for Palestinians Abroad, the person who runs it, the CEO, is a Zahar. Now, he actually happens to be the Floatia leader. And would you know, one of the other individuals who is spearheading the Floatia, who also is part of the Palestinian Conference for Palestinians Abroad, is from Spain. So how do we know this? Well, because according to document 3, the corporate filings for a Saber Neptune, a Spanish company, shows that individual as being the CEO. All of these entities are alleged as being Hamas fronts that include dozens of owned ships that are currently involved in the Floatia. All of these appear to be masking Hamas ownership via shell companies of the boats currently sailing through to Palestine. Yeah, I see how this is working now. So the bottom line appears to be that the Floatia itself is a Hamas-run exercise under civilian cover. Picture evidence is now being circulated of Greta Thunberg with Zahir in the background as being a supporter of her. And so this has led the IDF to claim that Greta herself is being funded by Hamas because Hamas officials seem to own the ship that Greta and those sailing with her are all sailing on. Now, in retaliation, the Israelis, led by a freed hostage, Emily Damar, is sailing towards the Palestinian ships, the Floatia, and there are currently 75 plus Israeli-owned boats that are sailing to basically act as a blockade to the ships. What this is all meant to achieve, I haven't got a clue, but apparently they're going to sit there in the waters and the Israeli ships are going to block the Floatia coming in. I don't know how this is all going to work. But in any case, UN experts, yep, there you can see we're coming full circle back to the UN, suggests that the Floatia's right, their right to freedom of passage in international waters, must not be intervened, and that if the Israelis intervene, it would be a breach of international law. Where this law comes from, I haven't got a freaking clue, but you have to ask yourself the question, why the freak is the UN getting involved in this? It seems to be becoming more desperate by the UN every day, and so we're now getting to a point where we have to say that the UN's involvement in this conflict is not impartial. The UN has a goal, which shows you that ultimately the narrative being pushed forward by Donald Trump that the UN is corrupt is probably correct. At least that's my opinion. You let me know what you think of that in the comments section below. Now, in other news, the US State Department has moved South Africa and Brazil to Tier 2 watch lists for human trafficking, citing insufficient progress despite some efforts made by these countries to stop human trafficking. So what does this actually mean? Well, if South Africa gets downgraded again to a Tier 3 countries, it faces sanctions. What these sanctions effectively include are non-trade US assistance restrictions, and the US could instruct multilateral banks to vote against loans to South Africa. So it could effectively stop us from getting, well, IMF loans. So how exactly is this going to work? Well, South Africa will now remain on the Tier 2 watch list for 2 consecutive years, and if no improvements have been made, it will graduate to Tier 3, in which case the sanctions will be applied. So what you're actually seeing here is that the narrative being pushed against South Africa appears to be ramping up. We've already seen the allegations made by the Trump administration against South Africa's persecution of the Afrikaners. We've already seen the refugee programs launched for South Africans. We've already seen the tariffs. Now we're seeing South Africa being downgraded in terms of human rights trafficking. It's not looking good for South Africa because of the failing governance structures put in place by the ANC. And as we've said before, this is mostly exemplified in AGOA because as of last night, AGOA expired. Now, there was a lot of talk about a possible 1-year extension, and some individuals still claim that a 1-year extension could be granted. I don't know how you have a 1-year exemption on something that's actually expired, but the reason for the 1 year's extension not being granted is because as of last night, Congress did not pass their budget, which meant that as of today, well, it's shut down. But in any case, South African officials, such as POPs, are still expressing optimism for a renewal. As I say, I don't know how you have a renewal on something that's expired, but apparently these individuals can tell me. I don't know how. In other news, you may be very happy to know that Julius Malema was found guilty in the East London Regional Court on 5 counts underneath the Firearms Control Act. Now, after a 3-day mammoth judgment had been delivered by the magistrate, Julius Malema was found guilty despite years of delays and irregularities in the trial. Now, the actual sentencing for Julius Malema will only occur on 23rd of January 2026. I myself don't expect him to be jailed. I think he'll probably only be fined. But it's all interesting to note that the actual case concluded in a guilty verdict. Now, for those of you who don't recall, the actual events occurred at the EFF's 5th anniversary, and that occurred in 2018, where a video circulated of Malema firing several shots from a rifle before handing it through to his, security personnel. Now, as part of that, it was meant to all be the whole, shoot to kill stuff. And that clip ultimately meant that Julius Malema was charged by AfriForum for, breaking the Firearms Control Act. And so there you have it. Julius Malema was finally found guilty of something. What he'll do next, whether or not he'll appeal the verdict or whether he'll just wait for sentencing to get his minimal fine, I don't know. You can let me know what you think in the comment section below.
Look, I don't know about you guys, but I think it's time for a new struggle song. Go to jail, ha, Malema, ha, ha, go to jail, ha, Malema, ha, ha, vrr, pa. That's the sound of the jail cell closing. Vrr, pa, 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 vrr, pa, 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 pa. Go to jail, ha, Malema, ha, ha. Viva! Viva, comrades!
On to a very final news article before we end this mammoth video. There's just so much to talk about. I'm very sorry for that. And this is around the tragedy that occurred in Paris. As you know, if you watched my video from yesterday, the ANC's ambassador to France was found dead in the inner courtyard of the Hyatt Hotel when supposedly he jumped out the window of his 22nd floor room. And apparently the reason for this was, apparently he expressed suicide and depression according to his wife. Now, very interesting, the prosecutors are saying that there were no signs of struggle, there were no traces of medication or narcotics found, and an inquiry has been opened into the cause of his death. But right now they're saying that he took his own life because he expressed his intention to take his own life, and it wasn't murder. Now, this is being reported from his wife, who reported him as being missing the previous day. She then claims that she received a message at 9:30 at night where he apologized and expressed his intention to take his own life. So, do you believe that? It's very easy for any individual, specifically any form of assassination groups, to go through and ping a phone, send out false messages, and make him take a swan dive. Whether or not it was suicide because of depression, I don't know. You let me know what you think in the comments. I know what my opinions are. At this point in time, I just have to note that he was fingered in the whole inquiry on police tampering, the ANC's involvement in terms of the current investigations. I noted that he was most likely due to be called to actually start spilling the beans. He was the police minister underneath Jacob Zuma. And what it could show is that the ANC's involvement or corruption of SAPS had been going on for decades, not just underneath Cyril's term. And so possibly, in terms of a crisis management mode, him taking a swan dive might have been the easiest option. But you can let me know what you think of that in the comments section below. In any case, that's all the news I want to talk about today. As per usual, these are all just my opinions. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Until tomorrow, bye.